Podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering a case that will send you on a roller coaster of emotions, so buckle up. This week we're going through the case of baby Dylan Groves, and I'm really sorry about no episode yesterday. I tried to post like a quick update. I came out to record, I was ready, everything was set, pulled up my notes, they were completely gone. This will be the second time this has happened, but this is the second time it's happened in almost 2 years because Saturday is the 2-year anniversary of Mama Murdered a Podcast. So I feel like 2 episodes worth of notes going completely like MIA in 2 years isn't bad, but I would still like to figure out why it's happening at all, because it's pretty frustrating. So I just wanted to apologize. I'm so sorry. We're a day late and $1 short, which is the norm for me. So, with all that being said, without further ado, let's get it. Dylan Groves was born on January 10th in 2019 to his parents Daniel and Jessica Groves in Ottawa, Ohio. Probably said that wrong. I should probably work on my geography pronunciation. But baby Dylan was born about a month earlier than he was expected to be delivered. Dylan weighed in at 5 pounds, 10 ounces, and he was 19 inches long. And it's said that while Jessica was in the waiting room, waiting on a room to deliver in, that she just kind of flat out refused to answer any of the nurse's questions about where she had gone to the doctor for her prenatal treatment. And the way that I understood it, it was like Jessica absolutely refused to answer any question that the hospital had that pertained to her entire pregnancy. And she also refused to give the hospital a urine sample. Now, after she was put in a delivery room, Jessica delivered Dylan only about 30 minutes after she arrived at the hospital, so another super quick delivery. But after Jessica delivered Dylan, she wasn't showing any sort of maternal instincts whatsoever. Jessica never asked how Dylan was doing, she never asked if he was okay, or even if he was healthy. And mind you, Dylan was born prematurely, a month early. And that sometimes comes with a few struggles for a newborn during their first few weeks or months of life. Preemies can have trouble regulating their own body temperatures, they can struggle with breathing on their own, and depending on how underdeveloped the baby is, they may also have to have a feeding tube if their jaw muscles aren't strong enough to suck on a nipple or a bottle. And those are just a few very brief things that premature babies can struggle with. There are a ton of other things that could potentially happen. But even with all of the multiple different health problems and concerns that come along with delivering a baby prematurely, Jessica didn't seem to be worried about any of those things or the health of baby Dylan at all. She never asked if she could hold or feed her newborn baby, and after he was cleaned up, checked out, and swaddled and placed in the NICU, a nurse brought baby Dylan into the room for a visit with Jessica, since Dylan was spending most of his time in the NICU. And when the nurse tried to hand baby Dylan over to Jessica, she just gestured with her head towards the wall and told the nurse to put him over there somewhere. So, she showed absolutely zero interest in baby Dylan from the minute that he was born. Which, I'm just gonna say it, these are all kind of red flags. I don't care how tired you are or how much pain you're in as a mom, you always want to hold and protect your babies at all costs, but especially a newborn. But not Jessica. She wasn't interested in holding him, feeding him, or doing skin-to-skin contact. Instead, hospital staff believed that Jessica was actually high on drugs. But Jessica still refused to answer any questions about, like, what, if any, illegal drugs she may have taken during her pregnancy, and also what, if any, drugs she may be dependent on. Hospital staff tried to assure Jessica that they only needed to know these things in order to be able to treat baby Dylan for any possible withdrawal symptoms that he may show. And while Jessica refused to answer any of these kinds of questions, her husband Daniel did finally speak up and say that Jessica was an active user of heroin, and that when she found out that she was pregnant, that she only used enough heroin daily to keep her withdrawal symptoms at bay. Daniel also let it slip that Jessica hadn't gone to any of her prenatal appointments because of her struggles with substance abuse. Now, after baby Dylan's birth, he was taken to the NICU, like I said, and his umbilical cord was sent for testing. And the testing that was going to be ran on Dylan's umbilical cord would show any and all illegal substances that Jessica used while she was pregnant with baby Dylan. And this test is just too good, y'all, because it can read all the way as far back as to when she was 20 weeks pregnant, which I had no idea that was a thing. But it is. And when the results from the umbilical cord were sent back with the results, it showed a positive reading for fentanyl, amphetamines, morphine, and meth. All of these things were in the system of a newborn baby who was also already premature. So with that, it should come to no surprise to anyone that shortly after Dylan's birth, the hospital staff noticed that Dylan was showing signs that he was having trouble breathing. And as the hospital personnel did their evaluation of baby Dylan, they were finally able to come to a diagnosis. Dylan was diagnosed with neonatal abstinence syndrome, better known as neonatal withdrawal. So this brand new, tiny 5-pound baby was withdrawing from numerous different illegal drugs and substances. He was also starting to tremble, sweat, and shake from the withdrawals. Now, 2 days after Jessica delivered baby Dylan, she was then discharged from the hospital, but she was discharged without Dylan. Baby Dylan ended up needing to stay for quite a few more days so that the nurses and doctors could monitor his withdrawal symptoms, which this is normal. But what's not normal is that for the entire time that Dylan was still in the hospital in the NICU, Jessica and Daniel never went to visit with Dylan while he was in NICU. Hell, they didn't even so much as call the hospital to check on his condition or see if he was making improvements. Jessica and her husband Daniel did not go see baby Dylan so much as one time while he was there. And I get it, they're both drug users, so maybe they don't have a car, but they didn't even so much as call to see if their baby was getting any better, any worse, just anything. And hearing this, you might be thinking that Jessica and Daniel are 18 years old, early 20s maybe, and that they still have time to turn their life around and get their shit together. But let me assure you that that is not the case. I want to say that Jessica was 38 or 39, and Daniel was maybe 40, 41 at the time that Dylan was born. So there's that. They're adults that just never grew up. So once baby Dylan was done with his time in the NICU, it was time for him to be discharged. But since both Jessica and baby Dylan had tested positive for illegal substances, that meant that the hospital was legally bound by law to report the drug abuse to DCF for them to get involved. So, social workers notified DCF about Dylan and a plan was set into place. The normal course of action would obviously be to remove the baby from the care of his parents. So, the plan was that DCF would send baby Dylan home with his dad Daniel, as long as Daniel could pass a drug test. And if Daniel was able to pass a couple drug tests, then baby Dylan would be able to be released into his father's care, but with some stipulations. One of those stipulations being that if Daniel took custody of baby Dylan, then Jessica would not be allowed to live under the same roof as Dylan and Daniel. But the hospital honestly didn't think that Jessica or Daniel, either one, would follow the rule of not living together, because at this point, Jessica and Daniel had been married for 20 years. And obviously, they didn't care enough about baby Dylan to even call and check on him at the hospital, so I highly doubt that they would put baby Dylan's needs above any of their own. All that to say that DCF and the hospital both didn't really think that Jessica would actually remove herself from the house so that custody of baby Dylan could be given to Daniel. And since no one thought that this would be possible, DCF decided that a foster family was going to be their best course of action. Andrea Bowling was a teacher and a foster mom, and she got the call on a Friday asking if she could take baby Dylan for an emergency placement that same day, which she agreed to. Her employer was even nice enough to give Andrea the time that she needed off in order to, get a new schedule for things together that she would need in order to be able to foster baby Dylan. Andrea's family and friends were incredibly supportive, of this emergency foster placement, and they made sure that she had all of the diapers, bottles, clothes, blankets, car seat, cribs, etc. I mean everything that you could possibly think of when you're being handed a newborn. Andrea's friends and family made sure that she had it all. And Andrea had also agreed to take a course at the hospital that would go over and teach her how to care for a newborn who was experiencing withdrawals. So she was ready to do whatever she needed to do. And Andrea later said that Dylan was the sweetest, most lovable little boy, and she just completely fell in love with him. Andrea also did note when and how baby Dylan's withdrawal symptoms would show themselves. She said that baby Dylan would break out in cold sweats and that he would want to be held constantly, and that sometimes he would shake uncontrollably while he was experiencing these withdrawal symptoms. But Andrea wasn't new to being a foster mom, and she had raised kids of her own, so she knew that patience would be her best friend in this case. And although Andrea was fostering baby Dylan, the goal is always reunification with the birth parents, and this case was no different. Andrea would have to take baby Dylan to the DCF office for supervised visits with Jessica and Daniel, and it was during one of these DCF supervised visits that Andrea noticed that Jessica seemed to be high on something during their visit with baby Dylan. After the visit, though, Andrea did let the DCF worker on their case know that she suspected that Jessica had been high during the visit with the baby, and shortly after this, the state of Ohio and DCF had a court date set to decide on who would get custody of baby Dylan, and it was also during this court date that it would be decided who would gain custody of Daniel's and Jessica's older son, who was 14-year-old Daniel Jr. So all this going on, and they have a 14-year-old also. Now, during this court date, it was decided that reunification was going to be the best option for Daniel Jr. and baby Dylan. And this would be with the same stipulations as before, where Daniel would be able to take custody of their two kids as long as Jessica wasn't living in the same house as Daniel and the kids. The deal was that Jessica would attend a drug and alcohol assessment, and that she would do weekly contact with the social worker, and that she would remain outside of the family home unless she was supervised and attended her supervised visits. Which, this all sounds a little too easy if you ask me, but hey, what do I know? After the decision was made that Daniel would take custody of baby Dylan and the couple's 14-year-old son, foster mom Andrea was made aware that baby Dylan was going to be placed back in the care of his birth dad. Andrea had been to all of the supervised visits with Dylan and his birth parents, and she knew that they weren't clean and that they weren't ready for reunification just yet. And she let her DCF social worker know that she felt that way. She didn't think this was going to be a good idea. But she was essentially brushed off, and all of her concerns were just kind of ignored and brushed under the rug. It was on January 25th, 2019, that a meeting took place at the DCF office between the birth parents, Jessica and Daniel Groves, foster mom Andrea, and their DCF social worker, Patricia Kraft. During this meeting, Jessica and Daniel were reminded of the drug and alcohol assessment. They also had to comply with the court order as far as the living arrangement goes, and they would also need to attend court counseling sessions. Now, after this meeting, Andrea pulled the DCF social worker to the side, and she voiced her concerns again, this time saying that she thought that Daniel was likely on some kind of substance throughout that entire meeting. But the social worker essentially told Andrea that Daniel didn't have a violent criminal history, and also that he'd never had an open case on him through DCF before. I don't understand what a violent criminal history has to do with being high in a court meeting, but let's continue. Because she also told Andrea that as long as Dylan could pass another drug test, that baby Dylan would be going home with Daniel. And Daniel did take that drug test, which he passed with flying colors. So on January 28th, 2019, Dylan was officially and legally reunited with his birth dad, Daniel Groves. And at the time of the reunification, baby Dylan was only 18 days old, and he was only in the custody of his foster mom Andrea for 13 days when Daniel was given custody back of Dylan. And of course, there really wasn't much that Andrea could do. This was a court-ordered thing, so she reluctantly packed up all of the supplies, extra diapers, and formula that she had gotten for Dylan, and she sent them with Daniel when he picked baby Dylan up to take him back home. But even at the time of the meetup where Daniel took baby Dylan home, Andrea was convinced that even then Daniel had been high. So again, she called the caseworker to let him know that she again suspected Daniel had been high. But it seems like nothing ever came of that either. So after the reunification, the social worker Patricia Kraft did her first in-home visit on February 4th, 2019. She noted that she didn't see any visible injuries and that all seemed well. Patricia did note, though, that Jessica had been holding baby Dylan during this entire home visit, which I'm assuming that this was a supervised visit where the caseworker met Jessica at the house to visit with Dylan while she was at the home with him. Because if it wasn't, then why the hell was Jessica even there? She wasn't supposed to be living there, and she wasn't supposed to have visits unless they were supervised. So, answer me that. Now, during this home visit, Jessica was reminded about the classes and the things that she needed to do to finish before she could regain custody. The problem with this, though, is that the inpatient rehabs and the drug assessment classes and parenting classes, they could never get a hold of Jessica when they tried to reach out and call her. And that became kind of a theme in this case. Jessica just avoids anything that may be a problem for her, and she just acts like it doesn't exist. Now, another home visit was done by the DCF social worker on February 25th, 2019. And again, during this visit, the social worker took note of the fact that baby Dylan looked clean, that she saw no visible injuries, and she was also told by Jessica and Daniel that baby Dylan weighed 8 pounds and 9 ounces. But all of this was just kind of taken at face value, because the social worker, Patricia Kraft, never actually checked baby Dylan for injuries, and she never weighed him to verify his weight. She never took his diaper off to see if he had diaper rash or if he was being changed often enough. Like, none of these things were checked. And I'm no expert, but I'm almost positive that this was DCF's responsibility, since they did still legally have custody of baby Dylan. Now, during this home visit, Daniel informed the social worker, Patricia Kraft, that Jessica had only been staying in the house throughout the day so that she could bond with baby Dylan. And I'm just going to say it again for the people in the back. I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure the agreement was that Jessica could only be around baby Dylan with supervised visitation. And I'm damn near positive that your husband that you get high with does not count as someone who can supervise those visits. And if that's the case, then Daniel just flat out told on himself and his wife. But it's fine because the social worker didn't take any action anyway. And I'm sure we've all just taken a wild guess by now, and if you've guessed that Jessica was still actively living in the same house as Daniel and baby Dylan, then ding ding ding, you would be correct. So this should all end fine, right? God, I hate when Child Protective Services doesn't do their job and protect the kids. Especially because it seems to happen more often than not. But let's get back to it. So now the March in-home visit was scheduled, but it was canceled. Daniel had called the social worker and told her that he was in Canton, Ohio, and that he was visiting with his sick dad. So the appointment was rescheduled. Except that the day came for the home visit wherein it had been rescheduled for, and no one was home when the social worker got there. She knocked on the door. With no one answering the door, she really had no choice but to leave, but when she got back to her office, there was a message from Daniel, and it said that he was still in Canton with his sick dad. Now, shortly after this, there was a ruling that said that while the state would keep custody of baby Dylan for the time being still, that he would be allowed to live with his dad, Daniel. Now, the next home visit was March 28th, and again, the social worker wrote in her notes that Dylan was happy, healthy, and that he had no visible injuries. And I just want to throw it out here, just in case I haven't mentioned it already, I don't really remember, but every time these home visits took place, Jessica would be sitting down holding baby Dylan for the entirety of the visit. And obviously, the social worker, Patricia Kraft, isn't doing any part of her job during these visits, because not one time did she weigh Dylan, pull his clothes off to check for injuries, or any other number of things that she was legally supposed to do by law. And nobody thought that this was weird. Jessica had absolutely refused to hold, feed, or even acknowledge that she had a baby while she was in the hospital delivering him. But now that DCF is involved, and someone's coming out to check on the well-being of the baby, now all of a sudden Jessica's holding him the entire time that the social worker's there. And this didn't send up any kind of red flags for the social worker. Okay, cool. So, Now, in April, the home visit went a lot like the March in-home visit. Jessica and Daniel claimed that they were in Canton again and that this time they were having car troubles. And from here, this just kind of became a cat and mouse game between Jessica and Daniel and their social worker. They missed or rescheduled any kind of check-in from DCF. And on April 17th, 2019, the social worker, Patricia Kraft, she tried reaching out to Daniel and Jessica again, but again with no luck. The social worker had been trying to get in touch with Daniel and Jessica to inform them that baby Dylan's guardian ad litem would want to do a home visit. She wanted to come out. And a guardian ad litem is like a person that is put in charge by the court, and their job is to make unbiased opinions and for what is in the best interest for the child. Basically, they're put in place to make sure that the child in question is being put first no matter whose feelings get hurt. It's supposed to be just an unbiased third-party person ordered by the courts to make sure that things go in the right direction for the child that they're assigned to. Now, by this time, Daniel had been calling and texting the social worker from a slew of different numbers, which is a good way to dodge DCF. They can't do a whole lot if they can't get in touch with you. Between the social worker and the guardian ad litem, no one had been able to get in touch with Jessica or Daniel. And once they weren't able to get in touch with Jessica and Daniel anymore, that's about the same time that the social worker was made aware that Jessica had stopped attending her group therapy meetings and one or more of her therapy sessions. And by not attending those meetings, Jessica was blatantly violating the agreement that she'd signed in order for baby Dylan to be given back into Daniel's care. But in all reality, Jessica had already violated that agreement from the jump because she wasn't supposed to be living in the same house as Daniel and baby Dylan, but she was doing that too. Now, it got to a point in between April 19th and April 24th where the social worker couldn't get in touch with Daniel and Jessica, so much so to the point that she eventually just got in touch with their 14-year-old son, Daniel Jr. And she did this during school hours while Daniel Jr. was in school. Now, while Daniel Jr. did say that baby Dylan was fine, when the social worker asked about his sick grandpa in Canton, he asked the social worker, who is that? What are you even talking about? So this was just another lie that Daniel and Jessica were, caught up in. So on April 24th, Daniel Jr. was removed from school and DCF took custody of him. And this is actually when Daniel Sr. finally reached out to the social worker. And maybe this was the social worker's plan all along, maybe she knew if she took custody of Daniel Jr., that Daniel and Jessica would have no other choice but to finally call her back. But Daniel was pissed. He didn't learn about DCF taking custody of Daniel Jr. until Daniel Jr. didn't get off the bus, and when Daniel called the school to see what was going on, that's when the school made Daniel aware that Daniel Jr. had been taken into the custody of DCF. So when Daniel finally reached out to the social worker, Patricia Kraft, she informed him that he needed to bring baby Dylan and all of his personal belongings to the DCF office. Now, Daniel agreed to bring Dylan and all of his things to the office the very next day. But if you guessed that he never did take baby Dylan to the DCF office, then you'd be right again. God, y'all are on a roll today. Daniel came up with about 101 reasons and excuses for why he wasn't able to bring baby Daniel to the DCF office. And this went on for quite a few days, 6 days to be exact. Because on April 30th, 2019, Patricia Kraft filed a missing persons report on baby Dylan Groves. And for the next week, between April 30th and June 7th, the social worker went out to the house multiple times to at least try to lay eyes on baby Dylan. But even when all of the cars were home and even when the social worker could hear people inside the house, they always just refused to open the door. But the social worker wasn't the only person trying to get in touch with Jessica and Daniel, though. The county sheriff's office had also tried reaching out to Daniel and Jessica about baby Dylan and his whereabouts, but they weren't having any luck either. Until finally on June 10th, the couple was finally arrested, but it had to be like this whole big dog and pony show. The couple's house was surrounded by a SWAT team and multiple officers. And it was essentially just like the movies where they're yelling over a big speaker telling Daniel and Jessica to come outside. Jessica did at one point come to the door in just a shirt and panties, and she told the officers that DCF had actually taken custody of baby Dylan months ago, and that she just wanted to be left alone. Now, obviously, if DCF had custody of baby Dylan, then they wouldn't have filed a missing persons report. But after the movie-worthy standoff, Jessica was arrested. But Daniel, on the other hand, he was in a 6-hour standoff with officers and SWAT teams surrounding his house. And it got to a point where officers were so worried about what Daniel was going to do and how he was going to react that they actually used a remote control robot to communicate with him. And they did this mainly because they knew that Daniel had multiple weapons inside the house with him and they weren't really sure where he was at mentally. But after that 6-hour standoff, Daniel surrendered and was finally arrested. Now, after the arrests were made, these two idiots just kept trying to convince these officers that baby Dylan had been taken into custody by DCF months ago, which we know this is a lie. And these two acted exactly as you would expect them to during their questioning. Jessica came off as cold and annoyed and couldn't even be bothered. Why was she even here? And Daniel was described as dope sick and rocking back and forth. But finally, Daniel caved. He told the detectives that he had actually found baby Dylan dead in his pack and play on April 28th. And I feel like this was shocking for anyone to hear him say. He just said it so bluntly, I found him dead in his pack and play. Now, the following day, after learning that baby Dylan had passed away, a detective took Daniel to a big area of woods behind their house where Daniel claimed that he and Jessica had buried baby Dylan. So, according to Daniel at this time, he found Dylan in his pack and play and he had already passed away. And then Daniel claims that he and Jessica decided to bury baby Dylan in the woods behind their house. But when detectives did take Daniel to that wooded area behind their house, Daniel claimed that he just couldn't remember where they buried him. Detectives were learning that this was bullshit, and the detective figured that if Daniel wanted to play games, then she could play games too. So this detective is so freaking smart because she pieced together that Daniel was lying, so she pulled the old reliable and put Jessica and Daniel in an interrogation room together alone. And we all know that these rooms are mic'd up from every angle and that everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. But apparently, Jessica and Daniel had already turned their brains into scrambled eggs because they obviously didn't realize that everything that they said to one another could be heard by all the microphones in the room. Now, Daniel and Jessica did try to whisper to one another, but duh, we can still hear you. So, after Jessica and Daniel unknowingly spilled the beans, Jessica was taken back to her holding cell, and Daniel finally cracked when the detectives alluded to the idea that they knew that baby Dylan had passed away already. But he cracked when they said that they would still like to find his remains to be able to lay him to rest properly. This is when Daniel revealed to detectives that baby Dylan's remains could be found in a makeshift grave. And this makeshift grave just so happened to be at the very, very bottom of a 30-foot deep well. Detectives had to set up recovery teams and bring in firefighters, and from my understanding, I don't think that the firefighters were told exactly what they were looking for in this 30-foot deep well, which I found a little weird. But this 30 feet deep well was so far out into the woods that even the firefighters that were brought in to help, they weren't able to get their fire trucks out that far into the woods, so they ended up having to carry all of their supplies and shit through the woods with them in order to even be able to get back there. Firefighters tried a few different ways to get to the bottom of the well, but finally they were able to pull something up from the bottom. And what they pulled out of the well was 2 plastic milk crates that were chained together and locked with 3 different padlocks. Once this makeshift grave was uncovered, the chained up milk crates and whatever was inside of the milk crates were taken to the medical examiner's office. And once the milk crates made it to the medical examiner's office, it was time to start peeling away at these layers. There were chains and padlocks around both of the milk crates, and once those were removed, the medical examiner could obviously see the chains and the padlocks, but there were also 12 zip ties, 8 water ties, and 18 rocks to keep the milk crates from floating back up to the top of the well. There were also 6 layers of plastic and duct tape that were wrapped around these milk crates in order to keep baby Dylan's remains inside of them. And I just want to remind you, in case you've forgotten, baby Dylan was still a newborn. I will try to find the least graphic picture I can find of these milk crates and where Dylan's remains were found and how. But just be mindful, it is a newborn. If that's not something you want to see, then don't go look for that post. Now, after all of these things were taken off of the milk crates and they were opened up, the medical examiner did find the remains of baby Dylan. After getting Dylan's remains out of the milk crates, the following injuries were found on his body. There were 2 skull fractures at different stages of healing, and we know what that means. That means that those 2 injuries happened at 2 separate times on 2 separate days. There were also 2 rib fractures that were also in different stages of healing, and again, we know that that means that those 2 injuries happened at 2 different times. There were also multiple other fractures throughout other parts of his bodies, with multiple bruises and lacerations, just all over different places on this baby's body. Dylan's cause of death was determined to be homicidal violence, but a more specific cause of death wasn't able to be determined just because of the state of Dylan's body. This was a newborn, y'all. A tiny, squishy, snuggly, perfect little newborn. And at the time that baby Dylan's remains were found in the well, his weight was only 4 pounds and 8 ounces, which is less than what he weighed at birth. He was almost 4 months old at the time of his death, yet he weighed less than he did when he was a premature newborn. And there was a toxicology report done that tested baby Dylan's liver, and those tests found that there were both meth and another illegal substance in his liver. How does a 4-month-old get into meth? They don't. I feel like the only love and nurturing that baby Dylan likely ever received was during those 12 short days with his foster mom, Andrea. They should have either left baby Dylan with Andrea, or they should have found a nice couple who wanted to adopt, or a couple that was having trouble conceiving, and just let him be with somebody who wanted him. Now, it was during the investigation that Daniel did say that he had witnessed Jessica hit baby Dylan on more than one occasion. But let's go back a little ways to the day that baby Dylan was removed from his foster mom Andrea's care and given back to his birth dad Daniel. Andrea says during the trial that she gave Daniel all of Dylan's things, like I mentioned. She sent his diapers, formula, clothes, quilts, the whole 9. But she also sent a Bible. And when she gave all of these things to Daniel, she had also taken the time to write Daniel and Jessica a note. And this note basically just said that if Daniel and Jessica would be willing to keep her updated on Dylan's milestones throughout his life, that, she would really appreciate it. But she also made sure to put in that note that she was only ever a phone call away, and that if they ever needed anything at all, that all they had to do was give her a call. She wrote her number at the bottom of that note. Dylan was only with Andrea for 12 days, and in those 12 days, she completely fell in love with him. She cared about him and his well-being. She loved him, and she had no idea when she watched Daniel strap baby Dylan into his car seat and drive away with him that he wouldn't even make it to see 6 months old. Now, obviously, after the discovery of baby Dylan's body, charges were brought against both Jessica and Daniel Groves, along with 2 separate DCF social workers. And during this trial, so many wrongdoings were uncovered. For example, the DCF worker Patricia Kraft should have been weighing and checking baby Dylan regularly during the home visits that she did make. And it was even said that DCF did not want to put out an Amber Alert when they learned that baby Dylan was missing, because they didn't want the public to know that DCF had been responsible for Dylan and now no one could track him down. Now, another thing that came to light during this trial is how Daniel had been able to pass those 2 separate drug tests that DCF had required him to pass in order for baby Dylan to be reunited with him after Dylan's time in foster care. And as it turns out, Daniel had only been able to pass both of those drug tests because no one watched him make a urine deposit, and he had actually used his older 14-year-old son's urine in order to pass those 2 drug tests that DCF had ordered him to take and pass. So no wonder those drug tests that Dylan took were squeaky clean, because the urine was from a 14-year-old boy, not a grown-ass man with dependency issues. But that's not the only thing that Daniel Jr. testified to, because he also said that he remembered after he had been taken into DCF custody at his school, that when he returned home, that he noticed bruises and marks all over Dylan's body, and 14-year-old Daniel Jr. had asked his parents, what had happened to baby Dylan. And allegedly, Jessica and Daniel told him that a dream catcher had fallen off the wall and onto baby Dylan, which is where the bruises and marks on his body come from. Which the lie detector test determined that that's probably a lie. And the prosecutor that headed this trial was Julie Cook Hutchinson, and when I tell y'all she is a badass, she was absolutely not playing these games with Jessica that she was trying to play. I linked a lot of the trial clips in the source credits under this episode, and I would highly suggest that you watch them if that's something you're interested in. Now, during the trial, Jessica took the stand in her own defense, and when she was asked if she was the one solely responsible for Dylan's death, Jessica agreed that yes, she was the sole reason for Dylan's death. And when she was asked if Dylan did anything to contribute to Dylan's death, again, Jessica said that he did not contribute to Dylan's death in any way, shape, or form. Basically, Jessica said that the only thing that Daniel helped with was the disposal of baby Dylan's body. And then Prosecutor Hutchinson asked Jessica to explain how she killed baby Dylan to the jury. Jessica repeated the phrase, "It was an accident," and Prosecutor Hutchinson is like, "I didn't ask for your excuse, I asked how you killed your baby." And this back and forth eventually led to the two women basically screaming at one another in the courtroom. Jessica did eventually kind of confess, though. She does say that she dropped baby Dylan. And then it's like Jessica tries to say that dropping baby Dylan caused every fracture and broken bone and bruise on that baby's body. And that just don't make no sense. Like, damn girl, how many times did you drop him? Once a day? 3 times a day? How many times are you dropping that baby to have, broken 2 of his ribs, fractured his skull in 2 different places, along with all the other injuries that he had? Like, you must have been dropping him from 10 foot in the air. And then it was Daniel's turn to take the stand, and Daniel kind of makes it seem like he didn't even know that Jessica was doing drugs while she was pregnant. He didn't learn until they were on their way to the hospital for Jessica to give birth that she had been doing drugs. Sir, we know that's a lie. He also tried to make it seem like he didn't start doing drugs himself until after baby Dylan's death. Which, we know that's a lie to begin with, or he wouldn't have had to use his 14-year-old kid's piss in order to pass a drug test for DCF. And when Daniel was asked if he fought to get baby Dylan back into his care, Daniel says he did. Then Daniel was asked why he even wanted baby Dylan back at home with him if he wasn't going to stop the abuse that Jessica was dishing out on the baby. Because Daniel does say that he saw Jessica hit baby Dylan quite a few times, and that she would scream at him, but then Jessica has also confessed to dropping him who knows how many times and from how far up. So Daniel doesn't really have a good answer as to why he didn't do anything in his power to keep his newborn son safe from his wife. Now, in January of 2020, Jessica and Daniel were both charged with aggravated homicide, kidnapping because baby Dylan was still legally in the custody of DCF. They were also charged with tampering with evidence, endangering a minor, interference of custody, gross abuse of a corpse, and 4 counts of felonious assault. But even with all of those charges, it only took the jury a little more than 2 hours to deliberate before they were ready to hand out those charges and sentences. Jessica Groves was found guilty on every single count that she was charged with, and Daniel Groves was found guilty on all counts except for aggravated homicide. And as far as their sentencing hearings go, Jessica was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Daniel was sentenced to 15 years to life on top of several other consecutive sentences, which all totaled up to be, I think, 47 years in prison. But the icing on the cake with this is that both Jessica and Daniel were convicted of all of their charges on the same day that should have been baby Dylan's first birthday. I feel like Dylan had maybe something to do with that. Now, after the light was shed onto DCF after how this case was handled, and about how quickly Dylan was given back to his birth parents for reunification, the DCF director actually stepped down from the position. And the way these kinds of cases are handled by DCF is being transformed because of baby Dylan. Because I'm sure none of us would be surprised to learn that Dylan wasn't even the first child that this particular DCF office failed. So maybe reevaluating things and how they're handled is their best option. A Senate bill was also introduced because of this case, and it's called Dillon's Law. Dillon's Law kind of lays out the list of things that parents must establish, maintain, and certain criteria that they must meet before reunification can even be considered. And this law is mainly focused on babies who were exposed to substance abuse before birth. And even after these things are done by their parents, and even after the reunification process is complete, under Dillon's Law, parents still have to have monthly home visits, pass random drug tests and alcohol tests, and their baby must see a pediatrician at least once a month. This bill is still in the process of being passed, as some argue that it would be too expensive to maintain and keep up with. But I don't know about you, but I'm crossing my fingers that this law does get pushed through. And I think that's all I have for you this week. I am so sorry about this episode being late. I promise you it frustrates me just as much as it frustrates you. Now, if you like what you've been hearing, if you've listened to 3 or more episodes and you haven't already, please consider rating 5 stars or leaving a written review on Apple. Supposedly it helps the show, so do that to help. Also, if you want more episodes, you can join Patreon. The link is always listed below. And I have one more announcement. There is officially new merch. It is less expensive, it is more practical, and I feel like maybe this is the way to go without trying to pay $30, $40, $50 for something. Because who can afford that in this economy? I know that's right. So, I am getting the link together. I am trying to get everything ready. Shout out to Teresa. Girl, you the bomb. So I will let you know as soon as I get that up. And maybe we can do like a flash sale. We'll see. We'll figure something out. But until then, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday, and not next Thursday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.